That's what I focus on. I don't really spend too much time on politics or other events. So the only thing that I really can talk about is economics. Economics are endlessly fascinating, endlessly funny. When you realize what is actually going on, you get a big chuckle out of it. But you realize also that we're all doomed. I mean, you can't run an economy. You can't run a modern economy, the biggest economy in the world, $17 trillion, on what is essentially phony money. We are running an economy, we have been for the last 50 years, almost 40 years, and on money that is not real money. And I say that to people, and they think I'm kind of crazy or kind of backward or, some relic from the past. But really, what has happened is so subtle and so clever and so curious that, you try to explain to people, and they just go blank because they just don't understand it. You say, well, look at that dollar in your pocket. What is that thing? It's just a piece of paper. And it's a piece of paper backed by the biggest military, biggest commercial and industrial power in history, but it's still just a piece of paper. And when push comes to shove, it will turn into the same value as every other unbacked currency in history. I mean, that's guaranteed. And you can see, watch what's going on in the financial news, in the economic news, and you can see it happening. This has all happened in the last 50 years or so. In 1968, the U.S. government spending too much money, spending it on the war in Vietnam and also on the Great Society programs, it ran out of gold. Didn't run out of gold because it had plenty, but it was sending money overseas to pay its bills. Americans were buying things from overseas, and those foreigners were accumulating dollars. And they could come back to Washington, to the Federal Reserve Bank or the Federal Reserve Bank in New York, and say, look, I got all these dollars. I want that gold that you promised me. Well, that just wasn't going to work. And so for a long time, a period of about 4 years, the U.S. government would just kind of argue with them and delay them and say, oh, you don't need it right now. We'll get to you later. And then all of a sudden they announced that they just weren't going to cover their debts in gold anymore. And that changed the whole system. And we've been running for the last 50 years, last 40 years on this paper money system, which has allowed the amount of credit in our system, because before that credit was limited because credit was based on money. People had to save something. You had to go out and you had to earn money, then you saved it, and then you lent it to somebody. And that lending was the credit market. And once that the money itself was changed, you had an unlimited amount of credit.
Let's quantify that, because I know you're a top economist and best-selling author, and you've been worrying about this for decades, and now it's coming to a head. Ron Paul has been doing the same thing. When you talk about, well, I only cover economics, at the end of the day, economics for our world really is everything and the metrics and how it operates. So it is the most important science in understanding how humans operate, how we interact, how economies of scales, from the low level to the highest level intersect. So this is the big enchilada, as you and others have said. But now we're getting close to that big event that you and Ron Paul and others have discussed. So you're talking about the Federal Reserve. You're talking about money used to be at least based on people had worked and earned it. Then they would loan it to you. That's what gave it value. They had earned it. Now it comes out of fiat. And now you're writing in your book, and I agree with you, that we're coming up to the edge of this. Continue breaking down the science of it, but then give us your take on, how close we're getting and what this collapse of the dollar system might look like.
Well, I think let's just stick with that point for a minute, because the whole of the U.S. government financing is the financing of all these social programs, the financing of the military, financing of everything else, and all of our personal lives, too, rest upon an expansion of credit which the world has never seen before. From 1968 until 2012, the amount of credit expanded 50 times. It went from 1 trillion to 50 trillion. And nothing like that has ever happened before, and it could only happen because they changed the money system. Before that, you couldn't expand the money supply because the money supply was gold. And because the money supply was gold, you couldn't lend out very much money because you didn't have any to lend out. And so the system was self-correcting and self-controlled until that time. So something has happened that never happened before in the history of the world. And now our whole economy, this is the important part, our whole economy and our whole lives, all of your listeners' lives depend upon something that can't continue. Obviously, it can't continue. You can't have credit going to the sky. It doesn't work that way. Eventually, things go up and then they go down. But listen, here's what's going to happen, because someday, and I'm not going to make a guess about when, because I think it's very hard to know. These things, like everything else in the world of finance and economics, things tend to go on a lot longer than you expect, and then when they happen, they tend to be a lot worse than you expect. Well, when this happens, what's going to happen is all of a sudden the people are going to look at those dollars in their pockets. The Chinese are going to look at those dollars that they've got in their accounts, and everybody's going to say, well, what is this really worth? What can I do with this? Because the U.S. government's printing these things like crazy to pay
And you
their
said
bills.
10 years ago that would happen. They're now saying that. So aren't we starting to see the creep towards the exit?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And we see it almost every day in the news where China is making deals with Russia, for example, and they're not using dollars. You know, this was the big achievement of the Johnson administration, was to make sure after Bretton Woods that people used dollars for their oil purchases. Oil is the biggest commodity traded in the world, and as long as you have to use dollars to make those trades, you need dollars. And as long as you need dollars, the U.S. prints dollars, and it can use those dollars to buy things. That's the way the whole empire is financed. The whole government, everything that we take for granted today is financed on this system, which is a crazy system. Finally, it just cannot work. And if someday, like the Chinese, everybody who's thinking about it, and that's about 5 people worldwide. Everybody's thinking about it. You know, they're thinking, gee whiz, this can't go on. So they are, as you say, they're starting to edge to the exit. And you can see the Chinese. The Chinese are very smart, and they've got a lot of dollars. And they also have an economy which is pretty soon going to be bigger than the U.S. And pretty soon they're going to say, no, we're not going to do business in dollars. We're going to do business in renminbi. And then what are we going to say? We're going to say, no, you got to do business in dollars. And so, no, that's not going to work. So pretty soon the demand for dollars worldwide is going to go down. And not soon, by the way. I don't think this is going to happen tomorrow. I think it's going to happen sometime in the future, maybe sometime over the next 5 years, maybe over the next 10 years. I don't know. But when that happens, all of a sudden prices in the U.S. are starting to go up. It's going to be harder for the U.S. to borrow money. It's going to be harder to sell those bonds, harder for corporations to finance themselves. Prices of assets in the U.S., like stocks, like real estate, will start to go down. Meanwhile, the costs are going up, and people are going to look at those dollars and say, well, gee, what is this? I think I'd rather have something else. And they might be, if they're a sophisticated international trader, they'll trade for renminbi, or they'll trade for euros, or who knows what. You know, they'll buy gold if they're smart. But if they're not, they're like everyday people. They don't have much choice. They get paid in dollars. They spend their money in dollars. And what is happening is the dollars they receive, or what will happen, the dollars they receive will be worth less in terms of what they can buy with them, and their living standards will go down. And there will be a panic. And when this happens, I mean, this is the interesting part, I think, really for you and your audience, is that, you know, this is what my book is about, by the way. This Hormageddon is a phenomenon in nature, and it's a phenomenon that happens in mass groups in societies where there are a lot of people, a lot of thinking going on, and a lot of groups and so on. But it happens, and the term, by the way, hormesis, comes from biochemistry, where a biochemist found that you gave a little dose of something to a patient or an organism, and it really was good. And you gave it more, and the thing died. And this is the process by which a little bit of something is good. And I see how that applies to almost everything. We know that was what Jefferson meant when he said, you know, the government that governs best governs least. What he's saying is, as the economist would say, the declining marginal utility of government is very high. Meaning it's very sharp. It falls off immediately. A little bit of government, you know, give me the rules, stick to the rules, keep it simple, keep it cheap. That's good government. As soon as you start passing Obamacare, as soon as you have the 60,000 pages of the IRS code, you don't have little government anymore. You've got big, expensive government, and you have declining marginal utility of government, which is to say a little bit was good, but a lot is terrible.
Well, let me just throw this in. Again, Bill Bonner is our guest, bonnerandpartners.com. Get Bill's book, #1.com. If you want to find out more information, get Bill's book, 1.com, or bonnerandpartners.com. You're tuned into the Alex Jones Show right now. That information was so important, I even skipped that network break earlier, because we've got to get focused on this, as Ron Paul has said, and I know I've read your writings, Bill. I read your newsletter, one of your newsletters, is that we're going to end up getting blamed as free market people, and capitalism's going to be blamed. At the end of this crony capitalist fraud, when it collapses, if we don't explain this isn't free market that we've seen, this has been smoke and mirrors, and we're coming to the end of the cycle. And sure, it's a safe bet to say 5 years, 10 years. Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, former head of the Treasury and Policy, the father of Reaganomics, has said the same thing here. But he's even accelerated it and said, no, it could be a year or two now, or even next month, because of the pressing. It's almost like our government wants to force folks out of the dollar by overthrowing Ukraine, moving forces in. I'm not saying Russia's good either. It's just these are provocative moves. Russia's now working with China. They didn't trust each other before. Working with Iran, working with BRICS. By accelerating the decline of the dollar, by accelerating economic moves, the QE Unlimited, the rest of it, and I want you as an economist to speak to this or disagree if you disagree, it's forcing the world, who aren't really innovators, I mean, a lot of these countries, to innovate away, and losing the soft power of a global dollar, world reserve currency, and the petrodollar. It's forcing a move. And is there a double game at the Davos level where they're coming out with their SDRs and other systems and their Bitcoins of the future? I believe Bitcoin will be the proto of a system they're going to bring out, because I've watched them in the past, and that they're actually preparing a global dollar crisis that they're going to profit from controlling, and that they will actually come out with the new system in the next 2 to 5 years. That's what my gut approximation is from deep study, if I had to go with my gut, because at a certain point, I'm not in the highest councils of these people. I know you run with a lot of big economists and people. I mean, how are you investing? What are you doing? I mean, that's a lot of stuff I threw out there, but
yeah. Well, Alex, you know, let me just continue this thought about what happens, because
let's talk about what's going to happen for me, and then and
then we'll come back to it. But I think it's important to understand that this phenomenon that we're discussing, phenomenon where you get a little bit of something and it's good, you get a lot of something, and it's not just bad; it's disastrous. It's disastrous. And I use the example of Germany after World War II, where Germany, they felt, and rightly so, they felt they had been stabbed in the back in World War I in the Versailles Treaty and everything. And what they wanted more than anything else after World War I was security. They felt that they didn't have any security. They'd been badly treated. Everything was bad, and they needed security. And so along came this guy who'd been, like a sergeant in the army during World War I, and he said, I'll give you security, and, Germany's got to take its proper place in the world, et cetera, et cetera. And he had all kind of nutty ideas, but he was essentially an economist, and he was essentially a world-improving economist. He was a meddler, an interventionist, an activist. And his idea, he was Germany, first, it had to have security, so they had to spend more money, more of its own money, to build up its military forces, and it did that. And this.
Well, you're right, and is there any way to reverse this, or to have a soft landing? We lost Bill. I thought that sounded like we'd lost him, because it just suddenly faded out and he was gone. That happens occasionally. If you're a TV viewer, we've been putting on screen different shots of Weimar, Germany. And when you came in to eat dinner for an hour, you'd want to pay up front because the meal might double or triple in price by the end. That just happened in Zimbabwe, in Africa in the last 5 years, where, basically a hamburger would be $1 trillion of their dollars. And they would have whole carts of money just trying to buy things. Okay, we're going to break here in a moment. We did get Bill back. We're going to come back to him and let him finish his point and continue on how we try to turn this around. Is there a way to have a soft landing? Is there a way to turn it around? He's a great economist, great writer. He's written 2 New York Times bestsellers. Hormageddon's coming out. We're going to ask him why it has that name, and can we avoid Zimbabwe level or Weimar level inflation in this country? You're already seeing a lot of food prices, record prices, a lot of other things are ticking up. But inflation will hit us last here. The dollar already, I've been overseas, is really turning into toilet paper. And it's a sad thing. Stay with us. We'll be back.
We're on the march. The empire's